Hi, I'm Peter Cowan. I'm going to do some processing of wax today. So how do we turn bits of this, bits of broken honeycomb and wax capping like this into that? So we're going to do some rendering of the wax. So we'll do it on a small scale so that you can have small amounts of usable clean wax that you can use to make all sorts of other things. So what I'm going to show you here is just a way to render some wax on a very, very small scale. So we're only going to do a tiny amount. This is not the way I'd recommend you doing it on a larger scale. So this is a mixture of cappings, honey, which is now crystallized, so formed a bit of a solid, and a bit of propolis and a bit of grubby stuff in there. Who knows, there could be bits of bees in there, all sorts. I'm going to put it in this coffee can that I've bent a bit to make a spout on it. And that's going to prove particularly helpful later on. So let's collect a couple of small samples of wax here. That should do us for now. Maybe a bit more, why not? So, I've got a little heater element here. I would certainly recommend do not do this on the stove in the kitchen. You spill a bit of wax on things and you get into all sorts of trouble. So I would recommend just investing in a very inexpensive one of these single hobs, and that'll be a lot less pain. I'm just going to do two examples of the wax. Put them. I'm going to start them, set up basically as a little bit of hot water in here, and I'm going to get it up to boiling. And I'm going to do a transparent version so we can actually see what's going on inside the can here. So hopefully, with it being glass, I'm not going to crack it. So I'll just warm it up gently. And it's not particularly warm in this room. Okay. So, what we're going to do is you have a solid in here which with temperature will separate out into a liquid. But we've got two solids in here. We have crystallized honey and we've got wax. And a third solid which is various bits and pieces which we don't want, which makes it dirty. So, we're going to take everything down to a liquid stage. And the advantage then is that wax, being much lighter than honey, and water for that matter, will float on the top. So we'll melt it down till it's all a liquid. We're going to let them go down and then cool. And in one version, I'll show you, if we just let it cool, you'd end up with a brick of dirty wax at the top and honey at the bottom. But we're going to do something a little different. So it's been heated through and now it's entirely liquefied. Now the reason I've done one in a jar is to show you the two levels. Wax, crud, and honey. So the wax floats on top and the cruddy stuff's in the middle. So what we can do, if we're just doing a small amount, is very carefully try to pour off the wax and we'll get some clean wax. So let's see what happens. So being careful not to pour the crud in. Got a few bits and pieces there. So try and get a better view. You see the clean stuff and the dirty stuff. Getting a little bit of dirt in there, but not too much. Now, the more you do this, the cleaner the wax is that you'll get off. And the dirty stuff will always sink to the bottom. So I'm just trying to get a better view. So being careful not to pour the crud in. Got a few bits and pieces there. So try and get a better view. You see the clean stuff and the dirty stuff. You see the dirty stuff and the clean stuff. So being careful not to pour the crud in. Got a few bits and pieces there. So try and get a better view. we had more in this can, exactly the same things happened. Nice clean wax, a little bit of dirt, we can pick out some of those bits. So that's going to give us more than enough wax to be playing with our little lip balms. This is the odd little bit of a bee, a little bit of dirt. Now, if you were looking to get really, really clean wax, what you do is just melt wax and do it in this pot again with just the wax. And that way you're going to get it really clean. Now, back here I have my wax melter. This is actually a piece of equipment that can double as both a honey heating tank or a tank to melt wax in. And in this case I've modified it somewhat in order to make it purely a wax melter. I'll show you some more pictures of it in due course, but we fill it up with water here. It's basically a water bath jacket in there, and the wax is in there, and I'll show you that in due course. Next year I'll take a proper video of doing large-scale wax rendering. Now, if I was doing a even larger scale rendering of the wax, not the large scale, but something in between these two, what would be easier to do is take something like a bag for straining paint or a pillowcase, fill up all the wax and old comb and that sort of thing into the pillowcase and immerse it into a vat of boiling water and keep it there for a good hour or so. Maybe 2 or 3 hours. If you submerge that bag, the wax will gradually melt and float up on top of the water. Before you finish, you take the bag out, wring it out, wearing really thick gloves because you'll burn your hands otherwise. Wring it out and just let it settle. And now, again, honey and water would go to the bottom and the wax will float at the top. Now, this wax will still be dirty wax. You'll have clean wax at the top of it and a layer of dirt, just like we saw in that jar. But what you then do is take that wax off, melt that purely on its own, and pour off the clean wax like we did on a micro scale here. I'll do that later in the season when I have enough wax to play with or enough time to do it. The wax is cooling down now. Beautiful yellow wax. So this is almost purely wax, still hot in the center, so it's still liquid. There's a bit of dirt in some of these, so when we flip them over, pop them out of the mold and flip them over, we'll see there's a bit of dirt in there. Right, so we saw that the wax blocks went in with a little bit of crud, a little bit of honey, that sort of thing. So what we're going to do now is take these out and re-render them. Oh yeah, it's quite a bit of honey, still quite a bit of honey in there. So we're going to re-render them to clean them up. So, but now what we have is very clean wax. We're nearly there, and we've got some good clean wax. But we have some honey mixed in with it. Those are those drops that went in as well. We'll clean that right up. Because once we do this, we've got a lot less stuff in the way. There's only a little bit of honey in there. Right, we'll start them heating up right now. We'll get the rest of these out. See how the wax floated on top of the honey? So the less of that crap you can pour in, the better. And keep that upright. Ah, more honey. Quite a bit of honey came out there. Much more than, actually quite a bit more than I realized. So we'll heat that right up. In the meantime, look what happened here. How it's stratified and cooled. I'll just turn this back on. Wax and honey. And as I recall, when I was cutting the caps off those combs, that was basically, I was doing quite a bit of honey that was starting to crystallize in the frames then. So there's quite a bit of crystallized honey in those frames. Hence we've got such a high proportion of honey to wax here. Now while we're waiting for that to melt, we've got this honey here, all this good honey, and the wax. The wax is still soft, so I poked some holes in here. Couple of air holes through there, and what we can do, may as well save that honey. Eventually. That's still perfectly good to eat. It's now, because it was heated up to boiling point, the honey has been burnt, so it's not going to be anything like as good as your freshly extracted honey. But this is perfectly good to use yourself. It's perfectly good to eat. A little bit hot, but tasty. Okay, this wax is melted now. Just hold it in the honey dropping down to the middle, down to the bottom here, and the wax nice and clean. I'll just very slowly pour this off now. And that's an ounce. There's another ounce. This one will probably get dirty. I'll try and stop just before there's a bit of honey going in. Now just before the rest of the honey goes in. So this is now probably 80% honey, 20% wax, as opposed to 80% wax, 20% honey. So now we'll just let this cool and we're ready to start. So that's how you would clean up very small quantities of wax. As I said, there's much better ways of doing it on a larger scale. This would just take a long time, but you can do it on a larger scale. This way, just melt it all down and pour off the clean stuff. Same principle will apply in all the other methods. Okay, so they've cooled down, and here we have a couple of ounces of beautiful, clean beeswax. So that's how I would render relatively small amounts of wax. If I'm doing a larger amount, I'll do it in a much larger purpose-built piece of equipment. But in terms of rendering small amounts of wax, you could do this for a couple of pounds of wax without any problem. In terms of how much wax this took, the amount of wax we processed here was probably in the order of 4 frames worth, 5 frames worth. I would say that on average you're going to get about 1/2 to 3/4 of an ounce of clean wax from each medium frame of cappings that you remove. So that is a way of getting a rough idea. This had a lot of honey in it because I processed this honey in the fall, and there was a lot of crystallization taking place and that sort of thing. So this is the very end of the season. Had it been much earlier in the season and the temperatures were much warmer, the honey would have drained out of the cappings, and those cappings would have probably been 80 or 90% honey, wax, not honey. You can also put your cappings on top of the hive and have the bees clean it up, which would make it probably 95% wax and not honey. But this is what I had at the moment, and this is the most difficult stuff to separate. So there you have it, a simple way of rendering wax cappings down into something very usable. Now to decide whether to make things like lip balms, hand creams, candles, that sort of thing out of these. I'm Peter Cowan, Bee Whisperer. See you next time.